Welcome to the Indxx Insights Podcast, where we explore trends shaping the global markets. I'm your host, Rahul Sen Sharma, and today we're talking about three rapidly advancing themes that are reshaping the future of technology: robotics, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity. Joining me today is someone with deep expertise in these emerging themes, as well as others, and also market dynamics. Tejas Desai, our special guest and Director of Research at X ETFs. Tejas, welcome and glad to have you on the show.
Rahul, great to be here. Thank you for having us.
So let's start with those three topics that I mentioned just now: robotics, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity. Most people watching and generally out there think of those things as mutually exclusive. But a lot of leading thinkers, and you yourself as well, believe that those things are actually really closely related. Can you maybe talk about why that is?
Well, artificial intelligence is the connective tissue when it comes to robotics, cybersecurity, and a wide range of other technologies increasingly. And based on what we've seen in the last few years, AI is clearly having a moment of reinvention right now. And I think that creates more opportunities in cybersecurity, in robotics, and many more markets. But from our perspective, we think that AI represents a true paradigm shift, and it will be many orders of magnitude bigger than what we've seen with the internet, for example, over the last 30 years or so. Primarily because there are several key factors on which the AI wave differs from previous cycles of technology. Number one is, I think, the rate of diffusion. If you think about the adoption that artificial intelligence is seeing, look at platforms like ChatGPT scaling to 700 million weekly active users in less than 3 years of existence. Right? That's unprecedented. From a user's perspective, you don't really need any new hardware, any new technology to really access these apps. Right? All you need really is an internet connection. So that compounds. And number two is the broad applicability of AI. Right? The same AI models that are being trained today can be used in financial services. They can be used in healthcare. They can be used in several other problems across the board. Of course, there is an opportunity to develop more technology in each of those areas, but I think there is a 15 to 20% sort of value unlock opportunity that can happen across these sectors that is massive. And number three is the exponential nature of AI, right? Every single AI model, again, is being built on previous generation of models. And every time users interact with these models get smarter and sharper and better. And I think that combination is very unique from previous tech cycles. It's unique from the internet, smartphone revolution, cloud computing, what have you, and could really bring that 10x growth with this AI wave in a very short period of time.
That's interesting. It really matches up with what we've read and seen around new technologies and how they're adopted more and more quickly as time goes on, right? If you read about, air conditioning or the telephone, those things took decades. The internet and other newer technologies have happened and been adopted much more rapidly. And it really sounds like that's happening with AI as well. Now, not just for personal use, but also for commercial use across sectors and industries. Before we get into that a little bit more, can we just talk about, the size of the opportunity, how large the market is, what kind of investment is expected in AI? Because a lot of people watching and who've looked into AI probably hear about large numbers. What are we looking at there in terms of investment into AI and the size of the market overall?
Well, to really put things into perspective, the internet took nearly 7 years to get to 100 million users. Mm-hmm. ChatGPT got there in 2 months. Wow. So the scale and the pace of innovation that we're seeing here is completely different. There is a lot of chatter about AI monetization and where the profits in the AI cycle really lie. But if you look at AWS, which took cloud infrastructure provider of the internet age and the internet era, it took almost 7 to 8 years to get to $1 billion in annualized revenue. Mm-hmm. You have AI infrastructure providers like CoreView, for example, getting to that scale in less than 2 years. Wow. So we're seeing this tremendous amounts of growth that is being packed in a very short period of time. And the biggest bottleneck right now is infrastructure and compute. So the natural response is to go back and invest in chips, in hardware, in the infrastructure that is needed to really unleash AI, on the global economy. Now, in terms of the total size and opportunity, look, today the digital economy is roughly in the $15 to $16 trillion range. So when you take the global GDP in context, you're still talking about 10 to 15% penetration in that market. And I think most business models of the internet age are mostly mature, right? But AI, again, opens up new opportunities, unlocks new consumption, You can bring new products to market. You can do a lot of things very differently, with these tools, and we'll talk about that. So I think you're easily talking about a 5 to 10 times more sort of expansion of that digital economy envelope to maybe 40, 45, 50 trillion dollars. The question is, how fast can we build that infrastructure to get there? And I think big tech's response, or the hyperscalers' response, with almost $500 billion to be spent on AI capex just this year alone, is sort of proportionate to that. So it's not as crazy as many people in the market believe. I think it's a proportionate response because the opportunity itself is so attractive.
Those data points are really useful because people often forget that $500 billion, like you said, sounds like a very large number at first. But if you look at it in the general scheme of things, a global economy that's over $100 trillion, a digital economy, like you said, that's 14 to 15 and growing rapidly, it's really almost a rounding error. If you look at the World Bank and some of the data they give on GDP forecasts going forward, $500 billion is within the margin of error. So I think it's important for people to keep in perspective that while some of these investment numbers do sound pretty large, and to me, of course, as well, they sounded pretty large when I first heard about them. They would be for anybody unless you're, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Larry Ellison now. It's actually not a huge amount of investment for a huge potential increase in rate of return as well.
It isn't, and especially when you think about how fast it is to earn profits or sort of recoup that investment, and the scale and the evidence that we have seen from many of these companies over the past couple of years. I mean, look at a company the size of Meta Platforms that has, one could argue, pretty much matured 5 years ago because there's only so many people that you can add to a social network. But because of AI and the investments that they've seen, even that they've made, even in the last 10 years or so, they're growing 20 to 25%, every single quarter, the most recent print as well. And this is unprecedented growth in a very short period of time. So for now, the profits may appear like they're locked with the Magnificent Seven names and the large technology companies, but ultimately it's the value chain, right? AI has a very extensive value chain. And when we talk to investors, we encourage them to sort of focus on that three-part investment story with AI. Number one is you have chips and hardware, which is foundational. AI needs very different types of chips. We've seen the NVIDIA wave play out. Outside of NVIDIA, there are a range of other components that go into that equation. You have high bandwidth memory. You have a range of networking solutions, interconnect systems that are very important. The second wave there, I think, is cloud infrastructure and data centers, right? And we're in that phase right now where we're moving from $100 million data centers to $10 billion data centers to now $100 billion AI supercomputing facilities, right? And I think that's a very investable trend and theme in itself. And ultimately, it's all about new apps and new solutions that will be brought to market, right? And if you look at any previous tech cycle, it has always worked in sort of those three phases. And I think that profit opportunity is still in front of us. And I think that's the framework that investors generally need to go to market with.
Do you see large language models hitting a wall? Do experts see that? And if so, what is the next stage there in terms of development of AI?
I think we've seen a lot of debate around that topic. I think there is some risk that the current generation of models could ultimately hit a wall. The response has been areas like test time compute, where we're seeing where the current generation of models again can be sort of moved towards a reasoning dynamic where they reevaluate their own response, sort of guide themselves towards a much more concrete and a definitive answer. But I do think that with the new generation of chips that you have coming to market, like NVIDIA's Blackwell, with the availability of more power, because on the compute side of story, power is becoming an emerging bottleneck as well, you can see more innovation on the algorithmic side that ultimately opens us up to this new generation of models. But I think we shouldn't miss the big picture here, which is that we've seen all this growth and all this innovation packed in the last 3 or 4 years, right? This is technology that we had no access to and no use cases for even a very short period of time back, and now it's really defining the entire global economy. I also believe that the current generation of models are extremely capable when they are applied in the context of specific problems, right? When you think about robotics, a model like GPT-4 is sophisticated enough to be employed or deployed on a factory shop floor to actually automate a wide range of industrial automation tasks, right? And that is a step function improvement from anything that we've had in the past. So I think it's a question, again, of not just scaling models, but expanding the applicability of those models. And I think enterprises across the board, although are moving at their own pace, are moving in that direction.
I think that's a good segue into the second topic that we discussed at the top of the show. Since now we've discussed AI, we understand, I think, and our viewers understand the huge opportunities as well as, the investments that are going to be required and also the applicability of AI as you've been talking about. Let's now shift to the robotics piece of it, and then we can talk about cybersecurity. Can we start by talking about the opportunity in the robotics market, where it is today, where it's expected to go without the AI piece, and then we can talk about the AI piece and how it's being utilized within the robotics market as well.
Robotics success story has been many decades in the making, and we're seeing that market grow about 15-20% for a very long period now. But I think AI brings a new unlocker into that equation, which is you have static robots start to be increasingly more sophisticated, which means that they can complement human labor in each of these settings, be it on the factory shop floor, in logistics centers, to take on increasingly more sophisticated tasks. And I think that is the opportunity going forward, which ultimately, in my view, will morph or take the form of a humanoid, and which you're starting to see more chatter around there with physical AI, with companies like Tesla, like NVIDIA, also looking at that hardware opportunity very seriously. And ultimately, we think that that's the big story within the robotics space.
So what has changed in the use of robotics today versus robotics in the 80s or 90s? Is it that they're more collaborative, that they're more intelligent, that the AI piece is coming in? And if so, how? Can you explain that a little bit more to the viewers?
Yes. So I think the collaborative nature of these robotic systems has expanded significantly. I think when you think about the robots of the 80s, they were mostly designed to focus on specific tasks. It was very expensive to design those robots because you couldn't apply them to a broad set of other solutions. So the broad applicability equation there was extremely minimal. Over time, again, because of hardware costs falling, because semiconductors have become easily accessible, because algorithms have improved, these robotic systems have improved significantly. And at the same time, they have become cost-effective as well. An average industrial robot used to cost almost $60,000 to $75,000, back in the 80s and the 90s, with significantly less capability. And today, that same robot offers 10 times more capability and costs maybe $30,000 to $45,000, in that range, $1,000, right? So we've seen almost cost fall down by 50%. We've seen 10x improvement in the capability there. And all of this without having the hockey stick improvement that we've seen in AI and chips over the past couple of years. And I think when you combine the progress that you've seen in AI and you bring it back to these collaborative robots, you can really expect an exponential improvement in capabilities and functionalities within the next few years here.
Wow. So what you're saying, if you boil it down to it, is robots were improving anyway, but now with AI, they're becoming increasingly collaborative and increasingly able to do much more complex tasks in conjunction with a human than they were doing before.
That is correct. More complex tasks, they can be more dynamic. And at the same time, when you look at the trajectory of how manufacturing wages have moved and the cost of human capital has evolved as well, it makes more sense to have automation systems, again, doing many of these low-value tasks, which I would say in many instances, human beings would be happy to get rid of, right? Think about a monotonous task on a factory shop floor, which is simply about fixing a specific element. If you're talking about the auto industry or something like that. We think that when you have these sophisticated robots into the mix, you can actually have a dynamic where human capital gets elevated to managing a swarm of maybe 4 or 5 robots. So it's really a managerial function, which I think human beings are good at. We're good decision makers. On the industrial automation side, we firmly believe that the opportunity that robots can ultimately fulfill is elevating human capital to focus on higher value tasks. I think the dynamic that we're looking at is one individual human employee maybe overseeing a system of robots or a system of humanoids or industrial systems on the factory shop floor. And cumulatively, that drives more productivity than having, let's say, one individual taking care of that repetitive mundane task. And I think that's the opportunity that we're going after.
That reminds me of what I saw a few months ago on the golf course. Traditionally, you'd have individuals mowing on top of a lawnmower. And what I saw was one guy with a screen in front of him on the course, and there were all these automated robots that he was controlling himself, and they were doing their own thing. And if they ran into trouble or something that they couldn't solve, then he would kind of get an alert and step in. So rather than have 30 people on different mowers, you had one guy controlling all of these mowers. So it made the whole process much more efficient from a human capital perspective, but also the whole course got mowed much more quickly as well. And that's just, for me at least, and I'm sure our viewers as well, think about it and have seen kind of real world examples. And the data you're giving now is really useful because it kind of ties in those kind of blank spaces that we don't think about as much. And suddenly you say something like that and it all kind of fits together. Something else that I think a lot of our viewers are curious about is humanoids. We've heard about humanoids. What is happening in the humanoid space? We've seen, things on 60 Minutes, Boston Dynamics, humanoid robots doing incredible things. What exactly are they doing today, and what is the potential use case of humanoids?
So with the advancements that we've seen in AI, I think the natural extension that you can find on the robotics side is where else can we apply these robots and what other form factors can they really take? From our perspective, we think that AI is the brain of the system and robotics is really the hands and the physical functionality of the system. And progress in one area really can drive progress in the other. I think with humanoids, it's particularly interesting because the world that we live in today is designed for human beings. When it comes to the buildings that we walk through or the physical spaces that we live in, the factory shop floors where we work. And so we need, in order to get robotics to take on bigger challenges and to take on bigger tasks, we really have to mimic the form factor of human beings to be able to work alongside the human beings. And I think that is the collective sort of direction in which the industry is progressing. We've seen significant progress from the videos that we've seen from companies like Boston Dynamics in 2015, where the robot was just trying to figure its way out, to where we are now, where you have a company like Tesla, for example, trying to get into the space very aggressively and redesign those platforms from the ground up. At the same time, we've had better chips, more power efficient chips. The actuators, the sensing, this complex dynamic has evolved significantly as well. We think that by 2035, you could have almost 100 million humanoids sold worldwide. We believe that applications and use cases within the industrial context will scale, but at the same time, you will also have domestic use cases scaling as well. When it comes to areas like security, when it comes to areas like aging care, caring for aging population, or even daily chores around the house, there is significant potential for these systems to function. And ultimately, we think that the rise of the automobile industry and how the automobile really transformed productivity and the economy offers some clues for how the humanoids opportunity will ultimately shape up. It's a $40,000 to $50,000 system that consumers can buy, that businesses can buy, that can perform tasks that, again, are mundane and nobody wants to take care of, or generally human beings shouldn't be taking care of. So from that perspective, again, we think it's a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity that will really reshape the entire robotics space.
That's amazing. 2035 isn't that far off. And the thought that we could have 100 million humanoids walking around on the planet doing some of these tasks is really, it's mind-blowing, and it's also really exciting to see where the future is going to be potentially taking us. Can we tie that into physical AI? There's been a lot of talk about that. I think there might be some confusion from our viewers and for myself around how that all ties into it. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you guys see happening in that space?
Yes, I think physical AI is the convergence of all of these intelligent systems that we use on a daily basis that are software, and really bringing them to the real world, or the physical world. We talked about humanoids, we talked about industrial robots, but into that equation, you have to also throw in autonomous drones that will deliver our packages, and you have to throw in self-driving vehicles, transporting people, but as well as goods also. And at the core of it, these are all hardware-based systems that are using sophisticated AI to progress and make things happen. I think the collective nature of that opportunity is defined as physical AI. But again, it needs more chips. It needs more algorithms. So when you think about all this AI infrastructure that we're building, and back to our original point there, which is this too much and too soon? But then you have all the training needs and the operational needs of these intelligent systems, which again operate pretty much fundamentally very similar to a ChatGPT-like model, right? So that's the opportunity. I think when you think about AI, we're mostly thinking about the software use cases, but the hardware use cases are equally compelling and potentially more transformative. And I think we could see some serious acceleration there as the cost curve of these chips, of these models continues to deflate.
That's amazing. Thanks so much for talking about the AI piece of things. I think I certainly understand it more now, and so do our viewers. And the robotics piece as a standalone piece, as well as how AI is really hockey stick improving that space as well. Let's now shift to cybersecurity as a standalone piece, as well as how AI is kind of enhancing cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is definitely something that's always been in the minds of individuals, right? We always want to be secure when it comes to our own data, but cybersecurity really seems to be something that's picking up now from a defense perspective as well. Can we just talk about the cybersecurity market from a big picture perspective? Because I've seen a lot of data out there around the size of the market today, around how it's expected to be over $500 billion in the next 5 to 10 years. Can we talk a little bit about what you guys are seeing today and what you guys see in the future for cybersecurity as a standalone as well as with AI?
Cybersecurity is a universal theme for the digital economy, for the AI economy over the next multiple decades, in my view. And it is a market that is just getting started. When you think about where global military and defense expenditures are today, we're spending roughly about 2.5% of the global GDP on defending the global economic model, collectively all countries included. But cybersecurity today is just a $200 billion market. I understand that there are some efficiencies just given cyber is tech focused and it's largely software in the modern world. But even if you take a 1% estimate of the global GDP system, again, you come up on $1 trillion market for cybersecurity solutions. And I think from that $200 billion base right now, growing into that market is a 5 times opportunity very easily. So cybersecurity is a massive market. It is clearly accelerated with AI because you have a range of new problems that AI brings to the table, but also the opportunity for leading cybersecurity companies to bring new products to market and tackle those problems in a very different way. So from our perspective, this is a theme that investors should think about as they think about the global digital economy over the next several decades.
So I see a lot of concerns there potentially about how AI can be used for positive as well as negative use cases. How are governments around the world getting involved to try and prevent the negative use cases?
At a high level, I think something changed during the pandemic that we had in 2020. I think cybersecurity got elevated from a technology problem to a national security problem. On the enterprise side, an operational problem and a strategic risk. We've seen a very strong response from the government to fill cybersecurity-related gaps across the board. I think the budgets that we've seen in 2021, 22, 23 have allocated or carved out specific allocations for cybersecurity investments across the board. We've seen money being directed to secure individual sort of state-level infrastructure assets, be it public infrastructure, be it military infrastructure. And I think the whole space is just taking shape because collectively the government probably spends about, here in the US, maybe about $50 to $70 billion on cybersecurity. When you think about the US GDP and put that number in context of that, it is still a very small number. Granted, some of that comes from the defense budget today, but again, civilian cybersecurity is such a huge portion, has very unique needs there as well. In our view, in aggregate, I think defense, military, government spending on cybersecurity could be a wildcard driver of growth because there are certain solutions that both sides need. It's the same vendors. You need those solutions for civilian use cases, but also for government use cases, and the vendors are the same, right? So it's an interesting opportunity that is just starting to take shape. And when you look at global military budgets generally expanding, the complex geopolitical backdrop that we are operating in right now, the catalyst only gets stronger over the next few years.
Was there a specific catalyst that got governments to really focus on cybersecurity, or has it been just a constant avalanche of negative news that we hear about?
I think it was 2 factors primarily. Number one, you saw a lot of attacks and vulnerabilities exploited in the government IT stack across the board. I think we had one major failure with the SolarWinds attack here in the US. Across the board as well, you've seen several legacy systems in the government generally being vulnerable and not being upgraded. The other factor was clearly in the aftermath of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, most immediately we've seen critical assets across Europe, across the US government establishment being a target for attacks from Russian hackers. So I think that was the first time where we saw cyber attacks really transform into state warfare. Naturally, you needed a comprehensive strategy to respond to that. We had to make up for budgets. We had to also look at technology gaps that were emerging that needed to be filled. But I think the third factor and under-discussed is the rise of AI and all these be it deep fakes or other forms of attacks that we're seeing where generative AI plays a very important and critical role. And AI systems are online 24/7, right? You don't really need a human being behind these attacks to actually orchestrate these attacks. You can just deploy an AI to figure out vulnerabilities in the system and does its own thing, which again opens up completely new challenges that need to be overcome.
Let's talk a little bit about defense and how the defense industry is using robotics, because I personally have seen a lot of news stories around the Russia-Ukraine conflict and how there's been a really rapid advance in, for example, drone technology. Can you talk a little bit about that for our viewers?
We're seeing a lot of innovation on the defense technology side where robotics, autonomy, even technology like drones is being applied in ways that we hadn't seen before. I think the war in Ukraine was a particularly strong example of that, where you have a side that is not militarily as advanced being able to defend itself against a side that has all the resources that it needs. When you think about drone technology particularly, what we're seeing is a massive economic asymmetry emerge, and that has lessons that will dictate US military strategy for a very long period of time, in my view. The drones that cost less than $1,000, retrofitted with explosives, are becoming capable of taking out equipment that takes years in planning to design and costs hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars. So I think this is a new regime that we need to prepare against, especially again when you think about an adversary like China for the US and their capabilities in technology, in commercial drone technology, in robotics, in autonomy. I think we need to fill some very serious gaps. And from that perspective, we see a massive acceleration and investment from the Department of Defense here, and again, the US industrial complex to actually make up for many of those areas. I think you can potentially expect autonomy broadly applied or robotic systems broadly applied in the defense equation 5-10 years down the line. And I think when you think about putting human lives at stake in many of these situations, robotics can be an answer to many of those dynamics and situations across the board. So the potential is massive. And this acceleration of military budgets and spending that you're seeing likely will divert some capital towards innovation within the space.
I think that's a great example you gave of drone technology because, again, you've got something that's extremely inexpensive that has the ability and has actually effectively changed the dynamic in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? You had tanks that were tens of millions of dollars or more that were now rendered basically inoperable or not nearly as effective by something that was so cheap. And I know that a lot of countries, not only the US, are very concerned about that, especially when they have very expensive pieces of equipment that now could be vulnerable due to the innovations that are happening in the robotic space related to defense. So that's a great comment, and thanks for that insight.
It's a big problem. I think we have seen very strong-willed response to counter that problem. The US here is working on something called the Replicator Initiative, which is a network of drones and robotic systems that can operate on their own for defense objectives. We've also seen the Golden Dome project, which I think people generally miss out on, but has to do a lot with safeguarding US mainland from these aerial threats, including autonomous drones, which is a massive problem as well. So this is technology, again, cutting through all sectors of the economy and creating opportunities and challenges that we need to address. And I think artificial intelligence is that catalyst that accelerates a lot of those problems as well as opportunities.
The example of missile defense is a great one because that's something that the US has been focused on for decades, interceptor technology. And it seems like for decades, the desire was there, the money and the spending and the funding was there, but it didn't seem like the technology was exactly there. And from what I'm hearing from you, it sounds like with AI and new technologies coming around, it sounds like that interceptor technology is finally getting there, right? We see it with Iron Dome in Israel. Of course, that's on a much smaller scale in terms of the types of missiles that it's intercepting. But it seems like from a ballistic missile defense perspective, the technology is finally getting there to allow this Golden Dome project to potentially be really successful and effective. Is that right?
That is correct. And drones, in my view, are the biggest driver of that because you have an adversary, when you think about China, that is at least 5 to 10 years ahead of the US when it comes to this specific technology. China's drone production capacity is at least 10 million units every single year when it comes to low-cost drones. The US has been very good at drone technology for a very long time, but we're talking about precision-focused drones and very expensive systems. So you have this new dynamic where you can have a swarm of drones that are low-cost to produce that can really create confusion and havoc on the battlefield and can be your first lap of attack. So how do you bridge that capability, and how do you really get to that particular level of defense systems? And I think again, the interceptor technology, as well as the Golden Dome project, which again is going to be a $100 billion plus, is already being allocated through the One Big Beautiful Bill to that, but is going to be much more expensive than that to actually build that whole thing across the United States. Can accelerate many of these key technologies.
So when it comes to sectors and AI adoption, are there specific sectors that you see really adopting AI rapidly right now? And where do you kind of see the growth in the next few years in terms of sector adoption?
I think the sector adoption is going to be broad-based, just given the broad applicability of AI. I think sectors where you have knowledge workers concentrated could see the use of artificial intelligence much faster than some of the other sectors. I think financial services, I also think healthcare is potentially one of those sectors, communication services, potentially information technology. We're seeing software developers, for example, really supercharged because of the use of artificial intelligence. Cybersecurity is one of those areas within that as well. So I think it's going to be a bit more broad-based there. In terms of sectors that can be accelerated because of AI, I really like robotics and the physical AI story. I think we've had industrial robots for a very long period of time. The install base or the beachhead for that opportunity is already established. And now you have one aspect of that story, which is intelligence really accelerated, which naturally drags the rest of the ecosystem along with it. I think with self-driving cars, with autonomous drones, again, with industrial applications of automation, as well as on the healthcare side of things with surgical robots and many of those areas, with new intelligence, you can really see use cases expand. So that's one area where I would pay a lot of attention for the next few years.
So of the three, artificial intelligence, robotics, and cybersecurity, not to put you on the spot, but which one of those three is your personal favorite in terms of innovation? And then my second question would be, which of those three do you believe will have the greatest growth curve in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, the artificial intelligence story is going to drive the economy for the next several decades. I think it is well broadcasted. If you look at valuations today, you can make a case that the market is fairly valued and is pricing in the AI story. In terms of opportunity on the table, I think the robotics story still is underappreciated. And that's where I would expect most of the growth to come from over the next few years here, most immediately, as those applications get to market. When you talk about humanoids, when you talk about drone technology, industrial automation, you also have a lot of reshoring related capital that is driving industrial automation. And then you have a low base where expectations are still pretty weak. So I think robotics is my pick for acceleration for the next few years.
I think that's a great example because during COVID, a lot of the supply chain issues were not only due to the virus itself, but a lot of them were due to the fact that the majority of US warehouses and supply chains was still largely manual, human labor. And there has been over the last few years a lot of capital expenditure to change that. I think a lot of companies, a lot of warehouses, a lot of supply chain overall have realized that they need to change. So I think that's a great example. Like the AI gets a lot of attention because it's sexy and new, but the hard work that actually has to happen on the ground is going to be done by robotics and humanoids, right?
The capital spending story is another massive catalyst. If you look at a modern distribution center, logistics setup, almost 25% of the cost goes towards automation systems today. Over time, that can keep growing. When you think about the reshoring of many key strategic industries that we're looking at here in the US, be it semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, most of these systems use a lot of automation, and you can't have people producing chips. These are automation systems. So again, I think that is a unique factor that we've seen in the aftermath of this geo-economic fragmentation that we had during the pandemic, which is we reshore a lot of industries, but we also rely on more automation and more systems to actually get the output that we need.
Tejas, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights. I really learned a lot, and I hope our viewers did as well. And that's a wrap on this episode of the Indxx Insights Podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, share it with your network, and don't forget to follow us for more insights. Until next time, stay sharp, stay informed.